Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and here on the podcast, we cover shows, movies, music that I'm trying to introduce to my friends and family, and we have conversations about it. Today's episode will exclusively deal with the season and series finale of Better Call Saul, Saul Gone, written and directed by Peter Gould, the showrunner of this very successful show. I'm pre-recording this, so I still don't know what we have in store for us here. This will be a very raw episode. Son and I will be having a true after-show conversation, giving you our immediate reaction. So the audio may be a little bit rawer than usual, but I do hope you appreciate the conversation. We're trying to get that to you as quickly as possible. Later in the week, check in for the weekend show. Nick is coming back on the show and discussing the new Marvel show, She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, and also giving me his feedback on the series finale of Better Call Saul. We'll have another segment of the musical daisy chain where we keep linking songs together, and we'll be previewing House of the Dragon, the next show that we'll be covering from week to week. So subscribe so you know when all those episodes become available. If you'd like to support the show, some easy ways to do so. Give us a rating if you haven't already. I know very few of you have actually given us a rating on your podcatchers of choice, but just tap the 5-star or whatever rating you'd like to give us, and it really does help grow our audience. The number one way we can grow our audience is to have you recommend us to your friends and family, anybody who might appreciate this conversation. And of course, check our backlog for other episodes you might find entertaining, other shows you might be watching or catching up on, or you want to relive them with us here on the podcast. And with all that out of the way, here is Peter Gould's closing statement on his show, Better Call Saul, the episode Saul Gone. All right, everybody, as I previewed in those opening comments, Son and I are hot off just minutes now, just for brief minutes from the ending of Better Call Saul, the episode Saul Gone.
I didn't realize that was the name, really.
You didn't realize?
Love that.
You like a pun. You love a pun.
I love a pun. That's such a good one, too. Works on different levels.
Exactly. And before we get into all that, I just want to point out a few interesting things here. AMC promoting the fact that, hey, Bob Odenkirk and Giancarlo Esposito are coming back in their own shows in 2023.
Yep.
And Vince Gilligan's new show just got picked up as well. I don't think it's on AMC. I'm not sure, though.
There was also a commercial for the next season of Your Honor as well.
Yes. I was going to ask you about that.
I don't think that's something the world needs. And I say that as someone who enjoyed the first season. But here we are.
I was actually going to recommend people binge that show for the fact that I just got a notification like on Prime that there's a bunch of these Showtime shows that are available to stream by the end of the month. And apparently this is not available there anymore, unfortunately. But something they did promote that I have not watched, but I have heard good things about that people might want to check out. On AMC Plus, there's that show, Kevin Can F Himself.
Yes, I'm so curious about that one.
And if you wanted to watch it, Sona, on Amazon Prime, there's this, for some reason, they have this through the end of this month. So you still have a couple of weeks left. You can binge that entire show. It's available there for free. So anybody who wants to check that out, you can check it out. And the last thing is that they did a lot of free promotion for shows we will be covering here. They had the House of the Dragon show, which is starting next week, and The Patient, which we'll be covering. Sona, did you see that preview? I don't know if you saw that.
I did.
So that looks interesting. And of course, Interview with a Vampire, which is coming in October, which I do plan to cover with my sister. She has read every single one of those Anne Rice novels, which I can't imagine because I did read Interview with the Vampire a long time ago when I was a teenager, and The Vampire Lestat, which I liked a lot, by the way. And I think I kind of got into the third book and kind of quit on it, but I think there's been like 9 of them now, and I've heard they're pretty terrible. So I don't know how she hung in there that whole time. But
I mean, I just feel like I've reached my limit with vampires and zombies, but my threshold was very low to begin with, I will say.
Oh, we have The Walking Dead, multiple Walking Dead shows that they were promoting today, too. So of course,
yes,
your zombies. Oh, I did like, by the way, of all these little promos that they've been showing, teasing throughout the running this show, I had not seen the one with Saul Suits, which I really liked this time.
Yes, very clever.
And I also had not seen, although I think this one's been around, I did like the one where you see the flyer with money for any information about Saul's whereabouts, and he's the one who pulls the note off the board, which I thought was very clever. So we open, and we're back in the desert. We have I don't remember the name of the episode, but this was from season 5 now, I guess, right? Was when he's getting the $7 million for Lalo and walking it
Mm-hmm.
across the
Mm-hmm.
desert with Mike. And I thought it was very interesting. He turns to Mike here. Did a couple things. He says, first of all, we're sitting on $7 million. We should just take it.
Mm-hmm.
And shades of what happened with the Kettlemans, right? He could have taken millions of dollars from the Kettlemans, and none of this would have happened theoretically if that was the case. Perhaps. Of course, the stakes are much higher here because these people will be coming looking for that money for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The Kettlemans could probably get bullied into never saying a word about that money. And of course, very importantly, Saul jokes that the first thing he would do would take 6 of the $7 million
Mm-hmm.
and build a time machine. And of course, this
Mm-hmm.
whole episode turns out to be a time machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says to Mike, if you could go back in time and go anywhere, where would you go? And the first place he says is 2001. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but then he changes his mind and says, I want to go back to 1984, which is when he first took a bribe. So now we kind of get a little insight into Mike's backstory, that was the beginning of this slide into the dark side for him.
Yeah, and I mean, you know that I'm not good with a timeline, and I like to have things spelled out for me. My initial instinct with that first date was that maybe it was that last conversation he had with his son about whether to go along with the corrupt police officers or not, but just total speculation on my part.
The time frame makes sense because we're looking at the Breaking Bad time frame being basically in real time to that show beginning, which was in 2005 or so. And then, looking a few years before then. So it does make sense. It would line up pretty well that, it would be something to do with his son.
Yeah, because we know how much that drives him, right? Of like the relationship they had and how he feels like he failed him. So that was my initial instinct and kind of backed up by when he backed the date out further to the date he took his first bribe. Maybe like, when you find it's kind of almost like a legal theory of like, what was the last clear chance to get
Right.
yourself on a different path, right? When
Right.
was the last time you could have avoided being in the situation that you're in at this moment? And you can kind of track it back to that one decision like, wow, if I had just that day left my house 5 minutes later, none of this would have happened.
Exactly.
Right?
And then Mike basically asks him, what would you go with? And he says, oh, I'd go and invest in Berkshire Hathaway back in 1965 and put half my money into that. And I'd be like a multi-billionaire by the time I traveled back to this date, which of course is what everybody kind of fantasizes about money. But
Sure, but also one of those things, I think we've all had conversations like this, right? Where someone asks you a question that seems to be very deep and you give a very reflective answer, and then they just give you this crap in response
Right.
where you feel like, well, thanks. I'm happy I bared my soul to you for that moment.
But Mike knows right away. And this is kind of the theme of the whole episode, right? That Mike's like,
Mhm.
you wouldn't really want to change anything. And of course, that's what Saul keeps
Mhm.
saying throughout the whole entire episode. I wouldn't change anything. But of course, we'll see how that all plays out by the end. Another funny thing here is just to pick some nits, just to be my overly logical self about these things. If he traveled back in time and tried to put that money to Berkshire Hathaway, they would not accept the money because it would look like counterfeit because the dates would be all wrong for 1965, and they would laugh him right out of the bank. Another reason that plan would not work, as if building a time machine wasn't complicated enough.
I like that he had a budget for it, though.
He did. He did. He was working that all out.
Should be able to get that done with 6 million.
Then we see the broken title sequence again that I referenced in last week's episode. And then we see Saul's on the run. I mean, they really are, they really were looking for him. This kind of, they go guns a-blazing right away. He's got a copter in the air. And at first you think maybe he's just being a little over paranoid. Maybe this is not legitimately the case. But by the time he gets home, cops are crawling everywhere. And he tries to escape into a dumpster. He tries to make the call to Robert Forster's vacuum salesman.
Mm-hmm.
But none of that. That's all for naught. The cops are basically standing outside the dumpster.
Mm-hmm.
And he's caught dead to rights, apparently.
Yeah, and I like that they didn't drag this out too much.
Yeah, I agree. But then it did make me curious to be like, well, what is this episode going to be about?
Yes. And I think they did a lot here, actually, that I preferred to a giant, may have been very tense chase scene, but that was probably going to end in the same way, one way or the other.
True. I like this detail here that the cops are watching his ads at the police station, just confirming that he is indeed Saul. The mistake of him to put those ads everywhere, right? Like, I'm sure they were only famous in New Mexico, but when he was on the run, I'm sure everybody saw them all over YouTube. And of course, he decides, wait a second, I have one more call to make. And he calls his old friend, Bill Oakley, who's
This
now
is the guy
working.
that switched
He
sides,
switched
right?
sides, exactly. It's like, that's right, Bill Oakley switched sides. And you see that Saul is suddenly feeling very cocky. And you're like, well, what is going on here? How is he so confident all of a sudden? And he shows up for the negotiations and he's got everybody there. The DA is there. ATF agents are there, drug enforcement, everybody. And they're like, you know what? We have like 180 years concurrent, but maybe we'll get you down to 30. How does that sound, Saul? And Saul says, I have a better deal for you. And he reads the room really well. And sadly, Marie is there, Hank's wife, and she is not happy about this turn of events at all. And he comes in with the story that we flashed back to actually just a couple episodes back. And now we realize why that was so important. That he says 2 years ago, this guy called Mayhew comes into my office and he put a gun to my head. And by the way, everything he says is true. And this is what
that's absolutely right. Yeah.
What a good liar does, right? He tells you the truth. And of course, it is a compelling story. And most importantly of all, he basically says, hey, you have a perfect record. You've never lost a case. Are you willing to put it all on the line? And he is able to finagle this thing where he gets 7 years, which is pretty astonishing.
And not even happy with that, though. He just keeps right on going.
Then he wants to be, he wants to go to this bucolic location of prison. I don't know where this prison is, but I guess I was sure if I looked it up, the writers know what they're talking about. It's probably a beautiful location.
I think they said North Carolina, right?
North Carolina, yes.
Yeah.
FCI Buckner. And he wants to be in Wing D. Has to be
wherever Bernie Madoff is.
That's right. That's right. They have a golf school and everything there. And I thought he was working some angle here. I thought that he the fact that I had to be in a specific wing, I'm like, does he know somebody there that can get him out or something like the Shawshank Redemption or something? But no, he's just trying to push things a little further. Then he wants that ice cream. Oh, I want my special ice cream delivered to me every Friday. And they're like, okay, all right. But
Enough.
He says, exactly. But he says, hey, he's pushing things. I have one more sweetener for you. Did you ever hear about this guy, Howard Hamlin? And of course, everybody laughs and they're like, oh, you think that's a sweetener? Guess what? I guess you don't talk to your ex-wife anymore because she came in and she told us everything, which, of course, is the first time that we see Saul kind of unnerved here. Now,
interesting since he's the one that told her to do it.
That's true. Well, that's the interesting thing about that. When you play it back, I was thinking about it when I was editing last week's episode, and including that audio, by the way, is exactly that. Is that he basically says that to her, and the way Saul's he's always running away from the truth. So when he's confronted with it, he just runs away, and then he does it to Kim, and Kim's the opposite. She's kind of like, he's right. I really don't have a reason to, I don't have any more excuses. I really should do this, and she does. Now, a couple of things I wanted to ask you from a legal perspective is, do you buy this at all? Would you see somebody actually reducing the sentencing down to 7 years? Is that even plausible?
Well, yeah, as usual, my disclaimer that this is not the field of law I practice in. Certainly, people do make deals all the time. I think, though, you have to really have something great that you're trading in order to make a deal like this.
Right.
And I didn't really see him putting up anything that would warrant such a drastic reduction in a sentence, and then at a country club type prison and all of that. So conceivably, maybe, but practically speaking, it just seems like very hard to understand why. I can understand why they'd make a deal. I can't understand why they would make this kind of deal. I did think it was kind of funny, the idea of the riskiness of a jury trial, and all you need is that one person,
right?
Because that is definitely, juries are a wild card, and you never really know what you're going to get and how people are going to think. So, there's something to all of it, but whether it would have ever actually played out this way, practically speaking, I do have serious questions about that.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I assume, maybe I'm giving them too much credit here. I assume that there is some information that he could provide. For example, the workings of Walter White's business itself, which obviously he was privy to. So he's probably giving them all that stuff. But then that's fair. And that's where they're telling him, even initially, that hey, we'll give you 30 years because, they do want him to cooperate to some extent. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'll cooperate, but I want much less than 30 years. Right. And then, to that point, they probably do want to dot some I's and cross some T's and, find out how this whole system actually worked, this whole business, and who else might have been involved. So I'm sure there was some value there, but still it seemed like incredible that they would reduce it so much. Except, like you said, I think that he makes a compelling case in the fact that he makes that story. He tells the truth, basically. And like he
Mm-hmm.
says, do I get one juror to hold out? How long is this thing going
Mm-hmm.
to drag on for? 10 years? Like how many retrials would you have to try to get me in jail at all?
Mm-hmm.
So I could see that. And then my next question for you is the next sequence. We're very happy to see Bryan Cranston yet again, Walter White.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that they were bunking together in, where were they? In the basement somewhere?
Now, see,
Yeah.
this I did not remember from
Yeah.
Breaking Bad at
Yeah.
all. And
Me
it
too.
very well could be there. I would not question it in the least if you
Right.
told me it was there. I just don't have a specific memory of this scenario.
Yeah. I have to do some research on this myself. I'm probably going to have a follow-up conversation later in the week. And I'll do my due
Mm-hmm.
diligence because I had the exact same reaction you did, where I'm like, I'm sure this actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And if I have watched Breaking Bad, which I have never rewatched, by the way, but if I did rewatch it dozens of times, like many people have, I probably would know exactly where this scene takes place. But I do not remember at any time Walter and him holding up. I mean, the only time I can imagine him freaking out was when he was saying, "Hey, I'm going to like basically ship out to Nebraska," and that seemed to be the last time they interacted. So I do not remember this at all. Unless the only other theory of the case I have, by the way, is that Walter was being disappeared by the vacuum guy, as was Saul. So was this kind of where they were kept
Hmm.
out temporarily while they were waiting for things to cool
Interesting.
down? Because they were in the same disappearing pipeline, right? So maybe this is their phase one, was being in this safe house first.
Interesting thought.
I could be wrong. There could be a specific moment in the show that this pertains to it. I do not remember it. I do. Once again, we go back to that time machine conversation, which
Mm-hmm.
Walter's not happy to to indulge any kind of science fiction about time travel. I do
But
like
I
this
love the
conversation.
way he cuts to the chase, right? Of
Yes,
like, what are
yes,
we really trying to talk about here?
exactly. These are regrets. That's what we're really talking about. Let's just talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I did like to see this. We got to revisit these moments with these characters we've grown to love over time, and kind of have these very one more interaction with all of them. And I really love, by the way, unlike some of the criticism I had of seeing Aaron Paul in this role earlier, I love how Cranston immediately is back in that Walter White character. You just
Mm-hmm.
feel Walter is there again, like the way that he is, on his high horse, smarter than everybody else, has it all figured out. And of course, we know that that was his downfall in a lot of ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find it, this is the pot calling the kettle black, where he's like asking if there's any kind of regrets. And he's saying that, he's being critical of Saul being like, oh, so you were always this way, right? And Saul like kind of
Yes.
Saul takes a little sting of that. But hey,
Right. Because
Walt,
once again, though, even here right now, the pretense of the time machine is gone.
right.
And they've said we're talking about regrets. And we know that one of the things that has, always been a sticking point for Walter is this business that his friends started and
Right. Yep.
with him and, became massively successful without him. So once again, someone has opened up to him and he tells this stupid story about a
Yes.
slip and
Yep.
fall, right?
Right. Exactly. It is interesting to think about Walt in this moment, talking about that I mean, we've heard this story before. Obviously, we know how hurt he was by it, but we also see this kind of revision he makes to that moment in time.
Yeah, and he literally says the words, right? That had that not happened, I wouldn't be sitting here with you now.
Right. And then, by the way, this kind of adds something that we kind of already suspected from Breaking Bad, but just kind of reiterates it once again, that is the thing that has kind of driven him to be this, or want to be this, drug kingpin. It isn't only about him doing something that he loves and feeling important and providing for his family, etc. It's also the fact that he knows he missed the boat on like being a multimillionaire and being somebody. And he's like, well, if I can't do it, if I can't do it in this way, like a legitimate way, then I'll do it in
Mm-hmm.
an illegitimate way. And he gets suddenly this, reprieve, like basically right before he's dying, to make this impact. And he, his ego wouldn't let him not do it. So, but it is interesting that we're kind of going back to the root cause of all of these bad behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, of course, Saul, always being Saul, running from the truth with that stupid, slip and fall story, like you said, can never admit anything true, really, in the show. He's always wearing a mask, even to himself. But of course, going back to that conversation where he doesn't have the sweetener that he thought he had, he is concerned about Kim.
Mm-hmm.
And we do spend more time with Kim. I wasn't sure that we'd see Kim again in this episode.
I
I was
was kind
actually
of
hoping. Yeah,
surprised. Yeah. I thought that was like her farewell last time.
it's interesting. I actually thought maybe there's some kind of reunion for them, maybe sometime in the future. And we get that, right? But not the way I expected, that's for sure. Oh, one thing I want to call out about when he does that confession is that he mentions that it was 2 years ago that Mayhew came into his office. So just to speak to the fact that this is pretty hot on the heels
Yes.
of the massacre, right? Walt's massacre, right? Of the white supremacists, right?
Yes.
Because you have to think about the math there. Once again, we know that that show begins with Walt's birthday. Canonical chronology of the show, pretty much until the very end, is 1 year, right? Because we see him have another birthday, and then we jump ahead. The day of the massacre is his subsequent birthday, so 2 years later. So basically, that
Hmm.
the time frame we see within Breaking Bad is 2 years. Saul's not there right away, but he's there pretty soon
Right.
thereafter. So this is probably just months after. Basically, Walt has just died maybe months before. Just to speak to the fact that his memories of Walt and these kind of emotional reactions he's having to Walt are probably pretty fresh, considering like
Very
what was like
recent.
all over
Yeah.
the news just days before, probably.
Hmm.
And also speaks to the fact that I think inevitably they would have found Saul, right? Because I figure that's still so fresh. I thought it was like years past what happened in
It
Breaking Bad.
had that feeling. Yeah.
I feel like somebody's going to notice him at some point. It's inevitable. What did you think about seeing Kim back in the office and just like all of a sudden the things that she seemed to, this weird purgatory she was in, which she seemed to have some passing life there. She seemed to take some pride in writing the catalog, descriptions. She was spending time on the actual floor, learning about the product she was writing,
Hmm.
the descriptions for. So it seemed like she was somewhat vested there in these friendships and in everything, even though it seemed, like I said, like we discussed last week, a little depressing. Now it seems like she's just a shell of a person when we see her there now, right?
Thinking about this. Well, we talked about last week how we were kind of seeing each of their version of punishing themselves for what had come before. So I'm just wondering if maybe it's more like now she has absolved herself of everything she's been carrying with her. So she's like, well, screw this. Why am I
That's a good
living
point.
like this?
Yes, that's a good point.
I have nothing I'm running from anymore. So what is this life?
If anything, she's waiting for the other shoe to drop because even like they mentioned to Saul, that potentially Howard's widow is potentially still
Yes,
ramping up to come
that's
after
true.
her. Although
Right.
that is, like we discussed last time, maybe an MPD threat because what's the point of that other than to torture her, right?
Right. I mean, this lady has enough money. So,
Right. And then Kim decides to do something good. She decides to volunteer for the legal aid at the legal aid office, and they're I mean, they're so desperate for help. They're like, "Can if you can answer a phone, then start working right now."
come on in.
And that's when she gets a call from the old her old friend at the prosecutor's office.
Hmm.
Kind of gives her heads up that Saul is coming to New Mexico to give testimony against Kim,
Hmm.
which of course is what he's trying to do is lure her out, and of course that gets her on a plane back to New Mexico.
Saul always has a plan.
He always does.
Hmm.
Saul shows up in one of his signature suits. He's back in his
So shiny.
so shiny. He loves the shiny suits.
Even in black and white, it was
Yes,
clear how shiny
exactly.
it
You know
was.
how loud that shirt is. Even it's probably that red that you see in all the promo materials. And you hear him say under his breath, "It's showtime." And the judge starts to question the sentencing here, which like we just did. It seems completely rational. And then he interrupts. Like, what did you think about this whole scene? This is like very improper.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a funny thing about being in court is that, like, in some ways, it feels so formal and there's so much pomp and circumstance to it. And then in other ways, it's absolute complete chaos. And so I feel like it was actually captured very well. Like the idea of like that one side that shows up with the army of attorneys and they're just introducing people for like 5 minutes straight. And then there's just like two guys on the other side. I mean,
Yeah.
that definitely happens, comical, people standing up to just interject something. And then the judge is like, a senior who's a little hard of hearing and like, I can't hear you. What? You've got to come closer. Like it just all sorts of like, it's really crazy because you can be in this really, formal, amazing, impressive courtroom and people are just like screaming at each other. So I found all of this really fun to watch.
This is a total tangent, but I do like the fact that, once again, Saul, like you've mentioned before, has probably more verisimilitude than most of these shows. But I do find it very funny when you do watch these shows on Netflix, for example, these documentaries, and you see what a courtroom is really like. And it's exactly like you said. The judge sometimes seems like to not be following what's happening in real time.
Yes.
The lighting is horrible. It's like very, institutional with that flat overhead lighting. And then, of course, there's often times where you actually hear the testimonies, which, if you've seen dramatizations, it's this very dramatic testimony. And then when you watch it in real time, you say, "Oh, was that even convincing testimony? Like that's the piece of testimony that convicted this guy, really? Like that? I don't even think I followed the logic of that story." Right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of funny when you see the reality of it versus the Hollywood version that we always get. And then he interrupts the judge. The judge is basically warning him, like, you better sit down because you have a great deal here. You should just take it.
There is like a very well-known idea among litigators of like, when the judge is on your side, shut up and sit
Right.
down. Like, you can only get worse. If you can see that things are going your way, just zip it. So yeah, it's almost the judge herself trying to tell him that.
I like that Bill Oakley tries to quit in the middle of this whole thing.
Yes, and we actually, I was watching with my husband, and his reaction was, she's not going to let him set himself up for an appeal like that. He's got to finish this now.
So yeah, so Saul comes clean about everything. He basically starts with the same exact story. And at first you might be thinking that he's pitching it, going like, well, let me tell you, this is the story I
Mhm.
told that convinced everybody. But that's not his plan. He's like saying, that's how I did feel, actually, for a moment. And we actually see that, interestingly, once again, when I was rewatching last week's episode for the podcast to capture the audio, you see when he is, in the back of that van,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
he is terrified. He's
Terrified.
panicked.
Yeah.
But of course, we also see the scene afterwards where he starts thinking, I can control this guy. And
Yeah.
we see the two sides of it. And that's what he basically admits to this week.
He was the mastermind.
He was the mastermind to a large extent. I mean, obviously, Walt was, his own person, but he did help in a lot of ways. And a lot of people's lives got destroyed.
Hmm.
And of course, this screws his whole entire deal. They even swear him in the middle of this whole thing so they can get it on the record. But he does get one little reward. He looks back at Kim, and Kim gives her just this little smile. And I think that's all he really needed at that moment. And then, of course, we see one more time travel, one more flashback to Chuck. We see him with Chuck.
I thought this was actually really poignant the way they brought this continuing theme throughout the show,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Back into the finale of the relationships you have, who these people that you love so much understand you to be versus who you actually are, and
Right.
how you try and break patterns, but you just can't, but you still love each other. And like, it's so complicated. And I think they did a really nice job of like distilling all of that in this conversation between them, where, he's saying, well, I could tell you about this stuff, but why? So you can judge me. And like,
Right.
he even says at some point, we just have the same conversation over and over. And I think, we all have those relationships in our life, especially with family, I think, right?
Yeah.
Where you love each other, you'll always be in each other's life, but this person is just driving you to drink because you are just having the same conversation over and over in different contexts throughout the course of like decades, right? So I thought, really beautifully done to bring that back. And the tying that together with the idea of, first of all, the literal book, right,
Yes.
about
A
time
little
travel,
too little
a little
literal.
on the nose.
Yeah.
And but finally, this person who's very like hashtag no regrets,
Right.
like, here is the real true how he didn't know where the limit was. If he could do it again, this is the thing that he would change.
Yeah, it's interesting, like you said, that they bring up all these different moments of time travel and all these characters in his backstory. And Kim, of course, very important, although oftentimes maybe took him in the worst direction. But like you said, this is maybe the root, to mirror what the previous flashback, Walt's instigating event, which is the him being feeling left out by that, people getting rich off of his own inventions, and then his ego in basically not even willing to be a partner, because when you think about that, he could have still had some success. He didn't have to be
Mm-hmm.
the big shot, and he ended up losing everything because of his own hubris. And here you have a situation where this is the root with his brother, right? That this relationship is what led to all of this terrible things that came later. because he was trying to fix this relationship and, unable to ever accept blame for his brother's death, and all these bad things that happened, which of course, by the way, he finally confesses for the very first time that he's like responsible for his suicide, which of course Bill Oakley even calls out. He goes, "What was that thing with your brother? That's not even a crime."
I missed that. That's hysterical. I totally missed that.
He just wanted to get everything off his chest, even stuff that doesn't matter. And now we see him on the bus headed towards Montrose, which once again, I don't know this prison either, but apparently it's not a nice one. It's the one he didn't want to go to.
Alcatraz of the Rockies.
Yes, Alcatraz of the Rockies. But maybe not so bad. He's a little bit of a celebrity. And even though I'm not Saul, I'm Jimmy. Nope, everybody calls him Saul. And we see him making the bread, putting his Cinnabon talents to good use.
Yes.
In the prison. And they still call him Saul. They're like, "Hey, Saul, your lawyer's here." And of course, who's his lawyer? Kim Wexler.
Whose bar card did not have an expiration date.
Which you did call out last time that you're like, "I don't think you could just quit like that." Apparently you can't.
Well, I mean, yeah, it just, I guess she did quit, but like she said, the bar card didn't have an expiration date, so nobody was checking.
There you go. And what'd you think of this final scene? We have this very, this show has always kind of been this sun-drenched noir to a large extent. And now we have a very traditional kind of noir scene here, this black and white in a prison cell, the dame and the guy with, against the wall, smoking a cigarette with the light coming through the windows. It's like almost like a kind of a standard issue for these type of noir
Well, you
films.
saw the orange flame though, right?
Yes. Good point. Yeah.
And I thought, to me, it was very reminiscent of when they would take their smoke breaks at the law firm, right?
Of course.
So kind of all coming full circle to how they got to know each other to begin with.
Exactly. So it's this kind of rekindling that camaraderie between them. And also the little flame with the color, like you mentioned, is a little bit of that old life, right? It's like whenever he's looking back on his old life, he has that color there. So there's still a little spark of it there. And I mean, this is where we end things, right? She exits the prison. She's exiting. She's walking past the fence and she is looking back at him. And then we see him through the fence and then the wall comes between them. And basically that's the last time she sees him. She can visit him as a lawyer, of course, but his deal's out the window and he's going to be in there for a very, very long time. So
yeah, 80 some years, right?
Which I guess with good behavior, hey, you never know, 30 years or so. He could be out of there. They can move back in together when he's in his 80s. You never know.
But with a clean conscience.
Yes, apparently so. So how did you feel that as a final beat on this whole entire show?
I liked it. I'm still processing it. Of course, it's been like not even an hour.
Right.
But I think it did a nice job of, addressing those themes that had been established throughout. I think it was a satisfying ending, not in the way that Breaking Bad was satisfying, where it just was like so intense and awesome that like they managed to do so much. Not in that way, but in a way of like emotionally satisfying.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think that, it was really nice to have those kind of grace notes with all these characters we've seen in the past. But I don't know that like this, that final image is maybe not what I was hoping for, like just kind of the final note I would have hoped to take away from the show. But like you said, I mean, we've literally just finished watching this half an hour ago, so we probably need to process it a little bit more.
You know why? I think, as I'm thinking about this in the exact moment we're talking about it, I think Breaking Bad had a feeling of finality to it.
Yep.
That this does not. But I feel like that suits this show.
Right.
That it feels like the story is not quite over. I feel like that's very in keeping with what the show was.
Yeah, I agree. And you brought up a really good point with just that little the flame when they light that cigarette, and he has that little bit of color again in his life, because like you said, it's a flashback. Once again, we're traveling back in time to those moments they had those stolen cigarettes back in the law office when he first met her. And like you said, maybe that's not the last of that color, right? Maybe there will be more. She will visit him. They'll still have this relationship, although he is, behind bars, right? So like,
no, he's not getting out.
Right. There's just so much they can, so much they can have as a relationship in that regard. At least he does get to have something. Two questions I have to you. One is practical. One is more like thematic. So one is that now he gets to this exile that he put himself into in Nebraska, where he is this other character. and he can't be himself, and he has to always be in fear that he'll be found out. So now he's in prison. He's kind of confessed to everything. He's now in this other limbo, but he at least has gotten everything off of his chest, and maybe he feels like he's doing his penance.
Yeah, and I think so much of this at least can be read as driven by his love for her, and going back to that conversation of like, you should turn yourself in,
right?
And him saying, you turn yourself in. And she does,
right?
And then, he kind of does his part too, even though his part is a lot harder to do than her part.
right.
So I mean, in that way, I don't know, I think this is my general feeling about life. I mean, just on a personal level, is like, it's so hard to know when the story is over, right? The story is, it's so often that the story is not finished between you and somebody else in your life. And that's one of the crazy things about living and having relationships, is like, sometimes the last time you see somebody is not, what you thought it would be. And you didn't realize it was the last time. You thought that story was going to go on. So I feel like it captured that idea of like, the story is not finished. It's not going to be the greatest love story ever told. They're not going to run away and live happily ever after, but I don't think they're done with each other either.
Yeah. I mean, the past is prologue, as they say, right? So maybe the story never does end. Yeah. So he still gets to have her in his life in this way. But the more practical, here's my practical version of this is, and maybe this is getting muddying my appreciation for this, which I agree. It's him finally reconciling everything in his past, right? He's finally, for the first time ever, possibly, accepting who he is. And Saul is gone, right? That's really the title here too. He is Jimmy, even though everybody's still calling him Saul in prison. So maybe Saul can't escape. Maybe that Saul part of him is still going to happen in prison, right? I'm sure you can start like some businesses there. And
I'm sure.
I have a feeling there's going to be more of that when they're going to have a whole other series of what his shenanigans inside the prison. But as far as the relationship with Kim, I assume she's going to continue to visit him. That, like you said, it doesn't feel final. He's not like saying, live your life without me. He is having that cigarette with her. He is kind of reliving that past with her. And I do think that they're kind of rebuilding to some extent that bond again. So I figure she will come and visit sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, like the intimacy of trading the cigarette back and forth, like it's so sweet.
And, but I think to myself, isn't there a way he could have kind of split the difference here? And ended up with like doing a little more penance than he did before, but maybe getting out of there in 10 years or something. But I guess that wouldn't have been as satisfying.
Kind of a show, though,
yes,
right?
I agree.
I just think it's not that kind of a show.
I'm talking like from a practical sense of like, this being an actual person and what they would do. But I do agree that in the show itself, if he's going to commit to this, he wants to prove to her that this isn't just another con he's running. He's just going to do it. And the only way to do it is to just fess up to everything. Right. So, and that's where we leave him. Saul survives this whole thing, but he'll be in jail for the rest of his life until we have like an El Camino-like movie where he escapes with a bunch of prisoners. They make like an "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" type film with him on the lam.
Could happen.
You never know. Him and Jesse could end up together, rooming somewhere in Canada or Alaska. Yeah. So that was the show. And just like our episodes ending on a whimper, just kind of like the show did too.
There you have it.
There we have it. So as far as the show, the podcast, everybody, we will be covering Only Murders in the Building. I have not seen this week's episode. Is it out yet? No. Is it? No, it's Monday. I forgot. I usually record on Tuesday, so the episode is available. Forgot what day it was. No, it's still Monday. So episode's not even out yet. But
that explains why we haven't caught up yet.
That explains why I haven't watched it. I haven't watched it because it's not out there. But we will be watching this week's episode of Only Murders in the Building and next week's. And then on Tuesday, I would assume, Sona and I will get together and we will give you our final thoughts on the end of that season. I don't know if you have anything to say about it right now, Sona, but I'm a little disappointed with this really cool twist they brought up in the show. And I feel like for the last couple episodes, they haven't done much. As a matter of fact, if you watch last week's episode, one of the characters is like, hey, nothing's happened on the show for like 5 weeks. I'm like, hey, I'm right there with you, buddy.
I'm not sure which twist you mean, but I will say that there was so much ambient light in places that there would be no ambient light and you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face in reality.
Good point. Good point. Especially during a blackout.
as someone who has experienced a blackout in a New York City high rise, yes, it can get really freaking dark in certain parts of the building.
The twist I was talking about, by the way, Sona, was that when they kind of revealed that there were these walkways inside the walls, I
Yes.
honestly was thinking, oh, wow, this is incredible. We are now going to see, for example, like they'll have suspects, but they'll be able to spy on them and like get additional clues. And then we actually see it briefly, just one time, where you can start having compassion for these people because we really don't know their real lives.
Yes.
And, and I was thinking like, wow, how cool that they've introduced this like additional layer of, this voyeurism, which of course in the city you're always spying on each other. And now in this case, you literally can spy on anyone you want within that building. And I thought this was just such a cool conceit. And they did like nothing with it. I was really shocked by that, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a fair criticism.
And I mean,
my criticism being that I know at some point people had flashlights, but at some
yes.
points they did not. And you really would not be able to see your hand in front of your face in that kind of environment.
Especially when you see them running around, in that most recent episode, like you said, when there is all this light leaking through the walls, you can imagine there's this light inside the walls. But when, during a blackout, it's like, where's the light coming from?
Exactly.
Unless they have emergency lights everywhere, but who knows? But anyway, all that being said, we have this week's episode and next, and the show is over. So we will be wrapping up the entire season. We get our final thoughts there. We got some of them right now. We'll get some more next week. Also, the following week after that, the show that, they had a little teaser here during Saul, the Patient on FX on Hulu. So available on Hulu. They call it FX on Hulu, but you can't watch it on FX. You have to watch it on Hulu, which is fine because who has FX anyway? And I'll also be discussing Better Call Saul later this week when I talk to Nick, who's also a lawyer and also watches Better Call Saul. He's watching this right now, so I'll get his opinion on it. And we'll also be, speaking of lawyers, be discussing the first episode of She-Hulk, Attorney at Law.
Uh-huh.
The new Marvel show, which is hilarious looking. And as a matter of fact, has Mark Ruffalo in there as the Hulk. And they have Daredevil back also. So they've kind of bring out some big guns to launch this show, which looks very silly on paper. But I am interested to see if they are doing something interesting with the character. I'm sure you'll be wanting to see that. A Hulk in the courtroom.
Yeah, you let me know how that
goes. I'm sure you'll be waiting with bated breath. All right. So we'll look forward to all of that, and make sure you subscribe so you know when that becomes available. And I'm sure, Sona, once we have more time to reflect next week when we discuss Only Murders in the Building, we might have a few additional thoughts on Saul as well.
Sure.
All right. Have a good night.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.